Let's talk relationships. And one of the greatest books that I feel like if every single person on the planet read, our relationships would be much more fulfilling, much more clear, and we would all be getting more of what we wanted out of them. Because I feel like we all kind of want similar things, but they seem like they're on opposing sides. And in order for us to all have what we want, someone has to lose or someone has to not get what they want, and that's not actually the case. This book shows you why. So it's The Queen Code by Alison Armstrong, and this book was revolutionary in my relationship and honestly just my relationship with men and people in general. So she calls it the Queen's Code, but honestly, it's just a story of how we as women can better communicate with men simply through the understanding that our communication styles are different. It's the same way as like we go to a different place, say I'm English and I go to Mexico and I'm trying to speak Spanish and I cannot understand. And it's like I now look at them as different, or our relationship has a little bit more heat or maybe tension, or it's unclear because things cannot be clearly spoken about and you cannot be on the same page if you cannot speak the same language. That's kind of how it is for our relationship with men. That game changer. Now, this is in no way, I notice people with this book, you bring it up and you speak on it. Women specifically are like, oh, more for me to do when he can't take ownership. And that is not the case because in life, in order to change anything, we have to start with ourselves. And it's not excusing men for things they have done. By taking ownership over where we may be able to impact a situation, it is not giving a free ride for men to do whatever they want. That is the first thing I want to say. Is because, yes, there is more we can do. It doesn't mean there's more that they can't do. But realizing where the change starts within us. And if you're not getting what you want out of the relationships that you've been having or being in, the common denominator is you. The common denominator is you. And maybe the men you've had, you can say, oh, are just awful. Oh, this, that. You can bunch them into a group and be like, oh, they're trash. All the things we say about them, especially in this way of female empowerment. It honestly seems like it's been a way where we can easily just put down men and not take ownership. Now, this is not saying one is right, one is wrong. I understand that society is built around the way men have built it. But at the same time, we would not have society if men didn't build it the way they built it. They have a place. Maybe things have not been done in the best ways for females to evolve and to have power and to do what they do. But nowadays, we actually have more, it seems. We're doing better than men in the corporate world. We're doing better than men financially in lots of places. We have the right to go out and work in the ways that we want. And through doing so, we've almost put men down a little bit. And I don't think it's going to get us what we want. But also, we have to realize where we need to take self-responsibility and not just say, oh, it's giving men a free ride. It is not. But we start with self-responsibility and accountability for ourselves. And through that, we realize our power lies within being able to understand and being able to communicate and being able to feel and being really in tune with our own emotions, that through that, it actually can allow men this space to rise up into this really in tune, but very like masculine server provider of a man that they all innately are, if we're not squashing them in order to have our power be seen. So I did not think this conversation was going to go that way, but it did. Now let's get into the Queen's Code, because this book is so good. I think I want to just talk on my top 2 or 3 favorite things about this that have impacted my relationship, just off the top of my head. So in communicating differently with men, it's learning how to communicate with them better. So ultimately we can get what we want, but they can get what they want. It's not manipulating. It's a way of, again, we're going to Mexico, and in order for us to thrive better in the environment and for people to help us, we learn their language. Simple as that. It's not having them have any power over us. It's simply just understanding the best way to communicate so we can all get what we want out of it. We can all thrive easier without all the other things we think are just a part of it. So, in this book, one of the first ways was one, understanding that we communicate differently. But one of the biggest things of an actual practice you can do is this 30-second rule, she calls it. It may be called something different, but I consider it just the 30-second rule. So it says women, we can think a lot quicker. Lots of things are connected. Not in the book, but I've heard about it explained. If women have a spaghetti brain, everything's connected, everything's touching, everything's a part of everything else. We can think of numerous things at once. We got a lot going on up here. It is lovely. It is a gift. And it also can be a curse. It is also completely different than how men's brains work. I've heard it explained as the way of like a waffle brain for men. It's like these individual little pockets, and they can go from pocket to pocket, and they're focused in those pockets. But in between, not everything's connected. Everything's kind of separate. And there's this like, not an emptiness, but not always something going on. And she explains it as like, they're doing something and they're very mission orientated. So when they're given a task, they'll work on it. And I'd love to know if men in the comments can be like, yeah, this is very true. Because my boyfriend had read this book and it was so fascinating to see his different takes on it than what I took on it. And also for him to have some of the ways he's felt explained in a way that I can actually understand, because men are not very adept with their ability to convey feelings and emotions, but also women grew up that way. We've been talking, gossiping, chatting since we were young, right? But then men aren't talking like that as much. They don't actually have the broad vocabulary to explain their feelings. Again, understanding that does not change anything. It's just understanding that they may not be able to convey the things that we want them to convey in the ways that we expect it to be conveyed. It doesn't mean they can't, it's just their capacity for it is different. So understanding this, men communicating things differently, and then being focused on one thing more than another in different times, I'm trying to get back to my train of thought, is understanding that is when men are kind of mission driven and given a task, they will work on it. But in between that, that's kind of that like nothing period. And this has had me understand my partner so much more, because it allows me to see that when I actually want to, no, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to go back to the 30-second rule, and I'll come back to this one. 30-second rule is understanding men's brains do not jump around the same way as we do. So it may not be as quick, but it does not mean he's not thinking about it and considering it. It's he's single focused instead of multiple focused. So often she uses an example of, we'll give men a multiple choice question and then we're waiting for them to answer. And in the time they're not answering, we're like, okay, it's been 5 seconds. I'm going to answer for you and give you more multiple choice questions. And then essentially you're not going to get to respond, and I'm going to assume what your response was. And you're going to be left there and we're going to think, he's stupid. He didn't think quick enough. He didn't consider this, all the things that go through our brain. And men are sitting there, single focused. So you ask them a question and they're diligently thinking about it. And she says 30-second rule. So this, you realize 30 seconds seems like the longest time in the world when we got a woman brain and we're thinking a bunch of different things. Ask the question and give him 30 seconds. Literally count it out, because it has been amazing in doing so. In the 30 seconds, it's been sometimes 27, and then he responds. Now, the other part of this 30-second rule is not interrupting him. Because his brain is single focused, he's going to be answering that question. And we can jump in, we can change topics with our girlfriends, we can do this. But with him, you want to let him finish speaking, practice patience, and then you'll often know when he's actually done. Now, I will tell you, the amount of times I didn't realize my boyfriend actually has a lot more to say than I've ever thought he did, because I did not let him speak. Or I'd finish it off, and then he wouldn't finish his thought because now he's on to whatever I was saying. And it's like, I thought I was this great listener. And then I started giving him 30 seconds. Turns out he has a lot of opinions, a lot of thoughts, a lot of things to say if I let him say it. That is a gift. That is a practice. That is a practice of patience, because sometimes it's the longest 30 seconds ever. But then he says it and you're like, oh, okay, you do have thoughts. I like this. And then we can go on. But it's it's so easy in that time to almost put men down or not give them the space. And it's like, hey, we want to feel heard. How heard does that make them feel? I bet you, if you start practicing that, you'll notice a difference in how your partner expresses themselves because they actually have things to express. How much are we not giving them the space to? So that was one. Another thing is realizing that they're very like focused on certain things. So this came to it example in my life is when like I would be getting ready to go somewhere and Sam had his to-do list. He had to pack, he had to do things. It was very like diligent, it was short, it was sweet. He would get through it and I would be packing, but I'd be doing the 15 things at once. All 15 things that I knew needed to get done, I needed to do. And I took it all on my shoulders because I did not expect that he would be able to do it in the way that I wanted it done. Expectations, so I would take it all on me. And then it would be all my thing to do, and then I'd get mad at him for not doing any of it, not helping him. Here, he was single focused. He did his, and he did not have another task. Now, this does lead into that thing where people are like, oh, it's a lot of like mental power to have to delegate a man to do certain things. Yes, and it can. How I've navigated it in my relationship is realizing that if I want his help in things, I need to clearly communicate that. Because if I'm always taking it on my plate, he now doesn't see it as part of his thing to do. So if that's been like the repetition of like he doesn't do anything, he's not going to start doing anything because he realizes he's not going to do it right because I've told him he doesn't, and that I need to do it because it's on my plate, it's not his thing to do. And then that's going to create that pattern. And then I'm going to be more mad about it because he's not doing it. But I've noticed when I take this into consideration and just be like, hey, can you help me with something? He's more than happy. He's up, he's at it. He's like, yes, what do you need? I'm here. But when I would say, I'm overwhelmed, you're not helping me, it's all on me, nagging at him, even though I've never given him something to do, or when I did, it was passive aggressive and then I told him he wasn't doing it right, it wouldn't get me anywhere. It wouldn't get me anywhere because he's not realizing that's me asking, that's me nagging. So this thing with our communication being differently is we need to be very clear. And I'm going to actually have this, I kind of skipped number 2, but this is going to be number 3. Be really clear with what you need. Men do want to serve, they want to provide. Then reading this, you realize it's very clearly once you actually notice it in the men in your life. Say, hey, can I have some help with something? They're on it. They would love to. But it's usually we're not asking in that clear way. And then when they do it, we're not thanking them. Because I've asked them for help with things and then I've expected it to be done a certain way. So I don't take time explaining. And then it's almost like an emasculating him. Now he doesn't have confidence to do it. He lost confidence because I told him he wasn't doing it the right way because an unclear expectation I had. Being clear as possible. So that may take a bit of effort in the beginning, but it is worth it in the long term because same way as you're training a dog, I'm not saying men are the same thing, like in the way of how simple it can be, it is that way. And honestly, if you take offense to that, you take offense to that, whatever. Because even through bringing it up to my boyfriend, he's like, oh, we are kind of like dogs. It's simple. You want to provide and you want to please. So we need to give you the things to do to provide, and then we need to show you that we're pleased. So often we're not doing that last part or we're not doing that first part. And then we're thinking they don't get us, they're not feeling understood, they're doing all the things. It's messy. So making it as clear as possible. So, for example, it can seem interesting to other people. So my boyfriend has read this book, I've read this book. It's changed our relationship because it's just very clear now. We realize nothing's really personal. We're just trying both to be on the same page. We can both get what we want out of it. So I was getting ready to leave my family's place, and I was doing things. He had done all his things. So he made sure the car was gassed up. He got his bag ready. But I'm going to actually say right now, I had to ask him to gas the car up because I didn't want to. That wasn't something we started in our relationship as a pattern of something he would do. And I would always be like, oh, I wish he did this because my dad does this. Nah. And then I actually just asked him, I was like, hey, you know what I would love is my dad always just makes sure the car's like good to go before we go somewhere. Can that be your job? Like, that makes me feel so good. And he's like, yeah, no problem. I could definitely do that. It was just easy. That's how he can help me out. That's how he can provide for me. And then when he does, one, he sees the ease it brings, but we can't forget about that pretty little thing of like, thank you. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement for them actually doing what we're asking them to do. Because if we're not actually, she explains it in the book of like playing for points, if we're not actually like giving them acknowledgement for these things, we don't need to acknowledge it all the time. And I notice in that some people are like, oh, he doesn't acknowledge me when the house is clean. Oh, he doesn't. Take a pause, because now it's outward. He doesn't. Okay, we start within. What can you do? We're starting within. So it's like, okay, if I start to acknowledge these things, maybe it's kind of the same way as a dog. If I give a dog a treat when it does something I want, eventually it'll get to where it does it. But also, you'll notice that men really mirror us. We teach them the relationship we want. So in our acknowledging of them, they can start to acknowledge us more. Right? In turn, they'll just start to mirror that. And it's a really beautiful thing. But you also can't control that. But it feels really good to acknowledge it. And then you see it. They just get excited. They're like, oh, I did good. I got acknowledged. They will repeat that behavior. They may need some reminders, because when that needs to be done may be different to them than when it is for you. But that's okay. There is that fine line of like, if they're just not doing it at all, you're being as clear as you can. You've tried different ways to express yourself in very calm ways of like, hey, I'd love if you did this. Then they do it or they don't. But we can control how we actually ask for those things. So I was using the example of, I was at my family's, I asked him to do the car thing, he did that, then he was sitting there because he didn't have anything next to do. He had in his single brain, he accomplished all the things he had to. In mine, I had 15 things. I had to have coffee and then hang out with my sister and do this. And like, my list was so long. And some of the things I needed to do, but once I actually just took a minute to be like, hey, some of these things he actually could do for me. He's not going to know he can do them though. So I could be mad and say, I have so much to do and you're just sitting there. I know that's such a common thing. Oh yeah, they're just sitting there and I have all these things to do. It's like, have we asked? Right? Have we asked? Or have we just got into the routine of taking on that laundry list ourselves and then not having them help out? And that's just become the pattern. And now we're complaining about it. So I was like, hey, it sounded weird to other people, but I was like, hey, I have some things. Are you doing something right now and just sitting there, or are you down to help me out? And I was just wondering where he was at, because he was sitting what looked like he was doing something. I understood through this, understanding his little waffle brain. He was in that like in between part before he dove into that next task. He was like sitting there keeping himself busy. And I could have been like, he's doing that because that's more important. No, he was like waiting for that next thing. And so I asked, and it sounded like my sister and my mom were like, holy, tell him he can get off his ass and do something. I'm like, no. That's how it came across kind of, and how it was said, like, oh, you're lazy, do this. But it was understanding a clear communication. I can complain about him later for not doing that, or I can ask like, are you doing something right now, or can you help me out? And then I gave him like 3 things off my list, because I was realizing, I'm like, he can sit there and enjoy that, or I can get my mental load like taken down by half by simply asking and being more clear and giving him a task. And he was happy to. Yes, I would love to do those. Then he did it. He came back and he did his thing. And it makes the relationship go so much easier. And we come back to this often, like where I'm realizing I'm not clearly communicating, but then also he's not picking up what I'm putting down, because I'm not putting down something that can clearly be picked up. Like being able to be understood. So clear communication, giving them time to actually speak, not assuming. And then the other one I want to do is always assuming positive intent. It's not often that actually men are like, they're doing things that they're doing and they're thinking about it, but they may not be thinking about it in the way that we have expected them to. So if they're doing something, assume positive intent. Don't always just assume that they're out to do something wrong, or that they don't respect you, or they don't care, or whatever it is, the stories that we can tell. If we assume positive intent, it leads us to be curious instead of critical towards them. Be like, I wonder why he did this. And I'll ask that. Like, Sometimes I think I expect something should have been done a certain way, or he should have shown up in a certain way. And I'm like, oh, he doesn't care. He's this, he's that, he's thinking of other things. He's right. We can go on our little stories, and it ultimately causes separation. And the idea in relationship is like to come together, to see the problem as a problem, and you guys are looking at it as something like to work through. So in this, it's like, okay, assume positive intent. Why would he have done that? And then actually asking. I'm going to assume you went into it with the best intent. What was that? Why did you do this? Being genuinely curious. Because they probably have a reason, or they literally didn't think about it the same way that we think about it, because to them it's not as important as it is to us. That doesn't make it not valuable to us, but if it's more important to us than it is to them, we need to clearly communicate that, have them on the same page. It's not a you're wrong, I'm right. It's just we see things differently. We see and perceive the world differently. What is urgent is different in our minds. If it matters more to me to be done a certain way, I need to clearly communicate that in a respectful way. And we're helping them with solutions instead of just nagging. Because with nagging, we give them no solutions. If we're like, hey, I feel this way, we can nag a little and then be like, but here's what you can do. Here's what I would prefer. They're like, yes, I will do that. I want to please and provide. And it's like, and then we love them for that. And ultimately, we're getting what we want. They're getting what they want. We have a more cohesive relationship. Or we realize we're not really meant for each other. And that may be another thing. Because if you're doing the things that you can and playing your part and taking self-responsibility on your end, and they're not matching that, that means there's not a match for where you're at and where you want to go. But also realizing it may take a little time, especially if you've built a relationship for, say, many years, never based off this. It may be a little uncomfortable to shift, but when we're doing it in a really loving, caring way, they'll notice that. But it's when we're doing it in this mean, angry, you gotta change, problems are because of you. Who wants to change because of that? It's easier to change from love than from force and like shame and blame. But if we're the ones who desire that, then we are the ones who need to take self-responsibility and step into that change first. If we desire it, we're the one who needs to change first. And often you'll notice that when you change first, and instead of saying they got to change in order for things to be different, if you take that self-responsibility, turn it inwards and do it, often they will either rise to the occasion or you realize they are no longer a match. And that can be a hard one. But it also is a practice, but man, is it a practice worth practicing. So that is my take on some of the things in the Queen's Code. The book is awesome for men and women. Like I said, I read it and have many pages like folded down and notes taken. And then my boyfriend read it and he got so many different takeaways. But the way he applies it and the way he sees it, it all just, oh my God, it works so wonderfully. And it all makes sense, and it's told in a really cool story way instead of it just being an information base. It's a story based on like this grandma that's going through and actually like teaching her through years of understanding men, and fast, like the way it's written is one of my favorite books to read, is because it's a story, but you also like digest so much of it because it's really applicable in a story way instead of an information based way, which can be like quite heady and feel like you have to study. This one's just like you just see it, because she basically is like going through a story as if you're like friends with people. And so yeah, super cool, definitely worth it. Those are my takeaways. If any of this brought value or some stand out more than the other, or you want more clarification, read the book or ask questions, and I'll kind of dive into different ways in our relationship we've played it out, or have seen it. And honestly, this is a book, if you're ever going to do a book club, this is one that's really, really good, because through doing it with different women, I had done this in the beginning, with different women, you can see the different takes that each person had, because this may rub some people the wrong way. And she explains it in the book of like certain scenarios when people would say things, and you can see where they're at with their awareness of wanting to take this information in, because for some people it's still, this could not feel like a good place that you have to do the work and then men get a free ride by not having to do it. And that's not the case, but that's how some people can actually take it, is like very resistant to be like, oh, of course it's me that has to change again. That's not the case. So really valuable that way. Definitely worth a read. And yeah, it's been awesome in our relationship. So glad I could share that.